We have a very fun show lined up for you today on Locked On Stars. On today's episode, I'll be joined by none other than Nathan Grav, aka Graviteh on YouTube, a guy that has been covering the NHL for quite some time now and has really, really great expert analysis. We'll be talking about John Klingberg, Joe Pavelski, the trade deadline and how it affects the Stars, and just the outlook for the Dallas Stars this season in general, getting Grav's insight on how the Stars will potentially finish out this season. All of this coming up on a Tuesday edition of Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, and you are Locked On the Dallas Stars. I'm your expert on all things Dallas Stars. It is Tuesday, February 8th, and today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. Well, as I said to open the show, today is a very special episode. In just a second, I will be joined by Nathan Grav, better known as Graviteh on YouTube, covering all things NHL, but he's also a diehard Dallas Stars fan. And so wanted to pick his brain a little bit on this Dallas Stars team and talk all about John Klingberg, Joe Pavelski, the trade deadline, and just the outlook that the Stars are going to have on the rest of the season and how we think they stand compared to some of the other competition across the league in terms of making the postseason. But before we get into that, do want to take a moment and say thank you for stopping by today's episode of Locked On Stars. Whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to and follow the Locked On Stars podcast wherever you get your podcast at, whether that's on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast at. But without any further hesitation, let's get right into today's conversation that I got to have with Graviteh. Welcome in, everybody. This is Dane Lewis with the Locked On Stars podcast, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. Many of you know him if you've been following the NHL, especially on YouTube for the past few years. I'm joined right now by none other than Nathan Grav, better known as Graviteh on YouTube. Over 51,000 subscribers, one of the experts here, covering the NHL. And Nathan, we're very glad to have you on the show today. How are you?
Very, very good. As I was saying to Dane earlier, it's always a pleasure to talk about the Stars, especially right now in the position they're in. So I'm ready to get after it.
Yeah, certainly glad to have you here on the show to, pick your brain on the Stars. I know that you have your foot across pretty much the entire NHL, kind of covering different teams and especially the trade market, which I know things are going to be picking up over the next several weeks, over the next month and a half or so with the trade deadline approaching. And of course, pretty much any guest that comes on, especially now, I want to ask the question, how do you see the Stars handling the trade deadline as it approaches? Do you think that they'll be selling guys? Do you think they'll be looking to buy? How do you see the trade deadline unfolding for the Dallas Stars?
Yeah, this is honestly going to be one of the weirdest and probably most controversial trade deadlines the Stars I think will ever have. I think it really dictates the future of this franchise because they're in this middle area. They're competing for the playoffs. And even though we have all the other situations surrounding Rick Bowness potentially being on the hot seat and a bunch of other stuff on the team, the trade deadline is kind of is going to be a weird one for the Stars. Again, they are in that middle area, but if they do want to compete, I could still see them maybe just staying put, maybe adding a couple of players, because it feels like, from my perspective, the Stars want to potentially have this year as their last compete year, truly. We already know that John Klingberg could potentially be gone pretty soon, and that's another whole situation to talk about. But with the trade deadline, honestly, for me personally, even though this was on paper heading in to be the last year the Stars could compete, even though the Stars play a better playoff system than a lot of other teams, I still think even if they make it, I really don't see this team being as successful as they were in the 2020 bubble. I could see them maybe winning a round, but I really don't think they're going to have as much firepower as they did back then, especially with the health of the team. And I think that's a big concern. I feel like with the Stars, though, I think it really depends on these next couple of weeks. I mean, the trade deadline's almost a month and a half away now. And I feel like if they go into March especially, and they're 2 points back, or potentially they're in that second wildcard spot, I could definitely see them staying put and maybe even keeping John Klingberg after everything we've seen. But if they are 5 points out, 10 points out, and if they're in that range where it's going to be too hard to get back, especially if they stay put, I feel like they're going to likely trade John Klingberg. That's the big one. But I could also see Joe Pavelski being a really last minute trade. That to me is the big one. Even though I love Joe and he's been so good, he would be a player that I think could even get more than John Klingberg, perhaps. It depends, though, on what the market's looking like with Klingberg and his health. But both would be rentals for teams, and I feel like it would be an interesting situation. I think Klingberg would be a much more likely trade to happen, but Joe Pavelski, I think, would be a fascinating one. He would be, I think, alongside Drew, the best forward on the market.
Yeah, I think, especially if the Stars, come trade deadline time, they find themselves out of the playoff picture. I think Joe Pavelski could very well be gone, because he's a guy that, especially after the season he's had in year 16, his best statistical year up to this point. I mean, who wouldn't want a guy like that on their team, and a guy that, hasn't won a championship yet. And so I imagine, if the Stars are looking to miss out on the postseason just by record, and with how stacked this conference is, and even the division, that the Stars could be looking to move him and probably get some pretty good return for a guy like Pavelski, because he would be a really, really nice piece for a championship contender. And you mentioned Klingberg right before we hopped on. I was kind of reading up a little bit on the Stars on the internet, and saw an interview between Mike Heika, who writes for the Dallas Stars, and GM Jim Nill. One of the last quotes that I saw from Jim Nill regarding Klingberg is that, one, they're still in communication and everything seems to be good as far as where they stand personally. But there was one line that kind of stood out to me from Nill, where he said that he's told John several times that if he continues to play well, everything will work out just fine. I think that's about the exact quote. You can, of course, listeners, go take a look for yourself also, but just kind of wanted to pick your brain on that and see, do you think that he means in general, if he does get traded, he'll go to a good team and get the contract he wants? Or do you think that means maybe if he continues to improve his play, that the Stars might look to somewhat accommodate him on the contract that he wants long term?
Yeah, that to me is a very interesting quote. I haven't seen it until today, until you just mentioned it. So I'm kind of giving my first reaction to that. I feel like it's more so. I feel like it's more so how Klingberg plays on the Stars that'll dictate if the Stars are willing to accommodate him. Mostly because I feel like one of the biggest reasons Klingberg isn't getting the contract he wants is because he's been a little bit of a declining player over the past 2 years. I think specifically, really since that 2020 bubble, it hasn't been as consistent for him, and the health's kind of been in question throughout. I think it's one of those situations where for the Stars, if his health isn't perfect and if his play is declining, he'll be in his 30s for most of that contract, and will be in his late 30s probably, because he wants that longer term deal as well. And it's one of those situations that for a player like him, if he can't stay healthy, then making that type of bargain is a huge risk. And especially since Klingberg hasn't been on that amazing elite level since, I think, 2020, I think it's one of those things where it's like, if you want to stay here truly, then I think Jim is testing Klingberg to truly prove it. And I think it's a really good test. I mean, for this next month, again, going back to how important this February is, if Klingberg is able to step up, or the team's able to step up, then I think Nill will reward them with potentially a couple of additions at the trade deadline. We were going back to that and how they could be sellers or buyers. But I think this month really does matter a lot for their future. And I think as Klingberg's a huge one. We all know that Pavelski's fantastic and he'll always be, but with Klingberg, if he can step up big, then the whole outlook of the Stars is different, especially heading into the playoffs. So yeah, I feel like it's more so, I mean, it could be both, but I feel like it's more so challenging Klingberg to be as good as he could be if he does want to stay here.
Today's episode is brought to you by Primal Origin Oils. If you or someone you care about has a beard, it needs to get Primal. Maybe you're that guy who has never considered the benefits of treating your beard with product. Primal Origin Oils will stop the itch and make your beard look healthy and groomed. The products are free from harmful synthetic ingredients and with low impact on our planet. Primal Origin Oils makes balms, oils, and whipped butter that are renowned as the best feel in beard products available. All products are fair trade certified and handcrafted in the United States. We know that every company claims to have the best, but Primal Origin Oils challenges you to compare their ingredients and the feel in beard to the other products you've used. We promise that you will see and feel the difference. Remember, the code LOCKEDON gets you 20% off at primaloriginoils.com. Again, use the code LOCKEDON at checkout for 20% off your order at primaloriginoils.com. Yeah, and I saw a few things on Twitter as well talking about maybe trying out John Klingberg playing alongside Miro Heiskanen. I know Miro, typically he and John don't share the ice together. Do you think a lineup change like that or any really other lineup change in general could be coming for the Stars in the back half of the season? I mean, I think the top line is obviously kind of set in stone. That's one of the best units across the entire league. That second line of Sagan, Ben, and Gurianov is starting to come together a little bit whenever they're able to stay healthy and whenever they're not healthy scratches. But do you think there could be any lineup changes coming for the Stars that you think could help them improve, whether that's on offense or defense, with maybe putting Miro and Klingberg together and maybe letting Lindell or Suter run together? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting for the Stars because they've been relatively consistent. I mean, the most consistent things have been that top four pairings, as well as the first line with Robertson, Hintz, and Pavelski. I feel like one of the biggest changes we might see is potential. Like, I feel like one of the big things that I've kind of noticed is Demani's play so far this year for the Stars. When he has played, I feel like he's had a pretty strong presence on that fourth line. I feel like one guy I'm kind of looking at potentially moving down the lineup, for instance, is Radulov on forward. I think he's been relatively inconsistent this year, and I feel like he's also a player that's been on a pretty sharp decline. In terms of the defense, though, I think you bring up a pretty interesting point with Klingberg because he's been on Lindell's side for a long time, and I feel like him with Heiskanen could work, but I also feel like that the chemistry that the defense has is, I think, one of the strongest things about it, especially that Lindell and Klingberg pairing since they've been together so long. I feel like one thing you could try, though, is potentially maybe switching up Klingberg's role in special teams, perhaps. But I feel like for the Stars, I feel like it just is mostly coming down to Klingberg and his responsibility to be better. Because he's still playing on the top four. He has a defensive defenseman like Lindell to be on his side, so he can have more responsibility offensively. But I just feel like a lot of the weight goes on his shoulders. We could see a change, but I don't know if Rick Bowness at this point in the season is going to go for too many changes right now.
Yeah, I feel like it would, especially nothing extreme. Maybe a few guys get shifted up and down lines. Like you said, Radulov, could get moved down because I agree. He's been pretty inconsistent this year and obviously dealing with some injuries. I know he had off-season surgery not too long ago, and I know Tyler Sagan's kind of in that same boat.
Yeah.
And so really hoping that guys like, both those guys and even Jamie Benn a little bit can kind of reassert themselves in the back half of this season. And I think, pairing Radulov with Jacob Peterson, that seemed to be working really well. And we talk about, you mentioned Damiani and you have Jacob Peterson. What have been your thoughts on the rookies for the Stars this season? I know I just said on yesterday's episode that the Stars maybe, fans got a little bit spoiled seeing Jason Robertson last season being in the Calder, trophy conversation. And now we have Jacob Peterson, we have Riley Damiani. We've even seen a little bit of Riley Tufte at the NHL level. What have kind of been your thoughts on the rookie guys that have played for the Stars this season?
Yeah, well, for one, Robertson being even better this year is, I think, one of the best signs for the Stars going forward. I think one of the biggest things going in this year was how Robertson would continue from his rookie season, and it's been amazing as continued. I feel like, honestly, Peterson's been the one that's surprised me the most. He was always a guy that I kind of saw as a depth player, and he is a depth player, but at the same time, he's a really versatile player. That's one of the biggest things I've noticed from him. He can play on different lines. He can play with different pairings and still be consistent. And I think that's pretty underrated in a younger player like him. But he played in the SHL for a pretty long time and played against men and had that competition to go off of. So I think he was a little bit more ready than people were expecting. But at the same time, I feel like he's been pretty impressive. And Daimani, as you mentioned, he was a player that I've kept a track on for a pretty long time since his OHL days. He was a guy that, like, the year after they drafted him, I was just shocked by how well he's producing. And as I got to watch him more, the more I was just more and more surprised by his quick style and really impressive maturity. And that translated to the AHL pretty well these past couple of years. And this year, I think, again, even though he's not playing that much, he's been on the fourth line for pretty much the entire time. I still think in that role, he's been almost perfect. And he, alongside Luke Glendening and Kiro, I mean, there's two leaders there right beside him that can kind of guide him a little bit. But I think Diamante's been really impressive, even though there has been some inconsistency issues. Obviously, rookies, that's kind of expected. At the same time, I think he honestly could be a pretty solid middle six forward for the Stars in the future, especially as he continues to get more ready and more prepared for seasons to come.
Yeah, I think he's a really exciting guy and really has been, kind of a spark plug for the Stars at times, going back to his NHL debut against St. Louis and scoring in that game. I know was a special moment for him. And even when he hasn't found the back of the net, which he hasn't too much, he, at least gets some good shots. And like you said, is building that chemistry with guys like Glendening and Tanner Caro. And another guy that I kind of want to, talk about a little bit, who plays on the bottom six for the Stars, is another forward who's been pretty quiet this year, despite, having a pretty, good place in a lot of the hearts of Stars fans, and that's Joel Kivironta. And what have you kind of seen from him this season that is lacking, but maybe, something that he can continue to work on? Because I feel like we all remember him for his performance in the playoffs a couple of years ago, but now it's just kind of been a blank slate. But we've seen what he can do. And what do you think is maybe holding him back from kind of going into that next gear to being a consistent player on this team?
Yeah, Kivironta has been a real weird one, because I think a lot of us kind of expected after the 2020 bubble. I think he was 23 at that point or something, but he was a player that after that bubble we were all kind of expecting to have a bigger role. But last year it was interesting too, because after that bubble he had 11 points in 26 games. When he did play, he was pretty solid and had like 12 minutes of average time on ice. This year though, it's been a much different story in terms of average time on ice. He has 9 minutes and 34 seconds, not playing nearly as much. But I think one of the biggest things that's kind of made that happen is just the healthiness of Sagan and Radulov playing every day. That's been a big factor, I think. But I feel like even though the sample size has shortened and his play has shortened, I feel like with Kivironta, there's also been some real consistency and just I really get the feeling that for him, there's just a real lack of I don't want to say maturity, but I want to say a kind of consistency and experience, if that makes any sense. I feel like there's some issues there when you get into the nitty gritty, especially in that bottom six, which is where he's playing most of the time. I don't know if he's fully suited for that role quite yet, and he's fully conditioned to that role quite yet at the NHL level. And I think that's kind of made a little bit harder for him to get a true impact. In the playoffs, I think it was a little bit of a different story because of maybe some more opportunity there. But I think in the end, it's kind of factoring in the position he's playing, when he's playing, and just how much he's playing that's kind of resulted in that. I still think he's a fine player and will be, but I just think for the Stars, he's one of those players I think needs to be on potentially on special teams, maybe on that middle six to truly succeed, and the Stars just haven't been able to give them that opportunity yet.
Yeah, and of course, always difficult with, lines being shuffled around. I feel like we'll get everyone healthy, and then you have, Jason Robertson misses a few games. John Klingberg misses some games. Michael Raffl's been out for the past little bit, and, it's looking like we're going to have everyone back, at the start of the second half of the season on Wednesday against Nashville, which will be a really, really big game. Yeah, fingers crossed on that one for sure.
That'll be a big one.
But yeah, all these games coming up for the Stars, their next 8 will be against divisional opponents. And, the playoff picture, especially out east, seems pretty clear right now of who we'll be seeing in the postseason. But in the West, I feel like there's still a whole lot of questions that need to be answered, especially, in the wild card and even the Pacific Division a little bit outside of Vegas. And so really, really curious to see how the Stars are going to handle the opening of this season. How do you think that they're going to, perform coming out of the gates? All these guys being on rest except Pavelski. And, he wasn't, just grinding his butt off in Vegas. He's having a good time, having his fun. But how do you think he and the rest of the team will perform kind of coming out of the gates for the second half this season?
Well, the thing is, for me, I think no matter what they do, I think what they show, whether it's good or bad, will either keep or potentially have Rick Bowness fired. I think this February is the most important month of his, like, obviously we can go to the playoffs, but in terms of regular season hockey, I think it might be the most important season or month that he's had to coach with this Stars team. I mean, like, as you said, the amount of divisional opponents and Western Conference opponents they had to go against. I mean, that last game versus Calgary, I think, was a huge missed opportunity to get some momentum going into the All-Star game. And that's one of those games that I know Rick Bowness would be absolutely fuming after the game with the group, having that type of loss. And I think he knows that his job is on the line this year. And if we do have a missed playoff season, that he's likely going to be gone for somebody else to potentially retool this team. And I feel like this February, I mean, Rick Bowness is a guy that I think under pressure a lot of the time has come through pretty well with this group and has gotten the group together. And even though we've had some issues there throughout this season, I feel like it's more likely than not that the Stars are going to be in a competitive position and will likely be more of a buyer this trade deadline. That's what I'm obviously hoping for. We all hope for the Stars team to be in a playoff position, but I feel like everybody on this team knows that this is almost the last shot. Like, I think Radulov knows specifically, Pavelski probably knows, Klingberg knows. I think a lot of the team knows that this is it. And they obviously still could lose out even with that mindset. But at the same time, I feel like they're going to have more motivation than some other teams in the wildcard race just because of that factor.
Today's episode is also brought to you by betonline.net. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues its march through the playoffs right down to the Super Bowl on Sunday. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football. BetOnline has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live, real-time updates of current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. Yeah, and I think this team poses such a threat if they're able to make it to the postseason because this group is a lot of the same guys that were in that bubble in 2020. You know, you add a few guys that weren't there just yet, but I mean, this is just a battle-tested group. I mean, even last season with the ice storm in Dallas and COVID and injuries, I mean, this team was almost in the playoffs, you know, up until the very end. And what ended up being probably the most one of the more competitive divisions with the realignments with Tampa Bay and Carolina in there, and even Nashville, who was not a bad team by any means. Last season, they ended up making the postseason. And so I think that that's going to benefit the Stars down the stretch. And, you know, if they do make the playoffs, it'll certainly be earned with, you know, I think 4 or 5 different road trips consisting of 3 or 4 games. And, you know, the teams that they haven't seen yet this season, like Toronto, who's a good team. There's a few other Western Conference opponents that they've only played once or twice or, you know, haven't played in quite some time, whether that's LA, San Jose, guys like that. And even the Rangers, who the Stars beat on opening night, but so much has changed for both of these teams since that moment. And so really, you know, going to be really, really interesting to see how this season shapes out and just kind of taking a step back from the Stars and looking at the league in general. Kind of at this point in the year, who do you think will find themselves in the Stanley Cup Finals from the East and from the West? Just kind of looking at how this NHL season has unfolded.
Yeah, well, for me, going back to the start, I had my predictions as Florida versus Colorado, and even though that was a pretty normal take, that was what I believed would happen. And at the start of the season, it wasn't looking too good for the Avs, and I was kind of like, wow, the Avs might be bad. This might be pretty fun to see. But obviously, they've come back and have still showed that they are amazing in the regular season. But I feel like this year is going to be the year that they actually do get something done, and especially the Stars miss the playoffs, they will have their boogeyman out, so that might help them. I feel like with the Florida Panthers, though, that's my one lock. Like, even though the Avalanche, I feel like will make the Cup final out of the West, I feel like for the Florida Panthers, they're the team that I'm just the most excited to see just do the most they can this playoffs. They obviously lost in the first round, but they went against Tampa last year in the playoffs, so it was the most difficult position they could have been in. And I feel like with this Florida team, everything is almost gelling for them. Bobrovsky's back in an amazing position, which I think is the biggest part of it. But Ekblad's in the Norris race. You have Jonathan Huberdeau being around the lead in points throughout the NHL. That to me, and the depth that they also have is so key. I've been talking about Florida a lot over these past couple of years as a team that's slowly becoming a juggernaut almost. And I think we'll see them finally reach that. And Colorado is another team, even though obviously we as Stars fans don't want to see them make it. I feel like it's just a matter of time before that. Like their team is just too strong, especially if they're going to add a guy like a Drew or even, heavens forbid, a Joe Pavelski this trade deadline.
Oh, I sure hope not.
Yeah, I was seeing some speculation that was a nightmare.
Oh, yeah. If we're gonna send Pavelski somewhere, I'd rather see him go somewhere out east where it's just kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And, not really going to a rival. But yeah, if he went to a division rival, let alone the Colorado Avalanche, that would be a tough one to watch. Happy for Joe Pavelski if they end up, going all the way and winning it all. But it's hard to, as a Stars fan, like you said, to support
only happy for Joe. Only happy for Joe.
Yeah, only we'll be watching to see Joe Pavelski perform. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that matchup seems pretty inevitable, and especially on the Eastern Conference side of things. I think Florida is just such an offensive juggernaut, and I think a series like between them and Tampa Bay could be interesting in the playoffs, or even New York. The Rangers, having a really nice year. Shesterkin on the top of a lot of lists to win the Vezina Trophy this season, and rightfully so. And speaking of awards, and you mentioned Jonathan Huberdeau, I was looking earlier and saw a list. I believe it was from The Athletic, and I'm not sure who all has input on those, but they had some projections for the Hart Trophy race, and I didn't see Jonathan Huberdeau on that list. Joe Pavelski was on there at 10th, but I just thought that was really interesting given the season he's had. Why do you think he would maybe be left out of that conversation for the Hart Trophy?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it mostly goes back to the kind of like Leon Draisaitl, Connor McDavid thing, where you have an amazing player beside you, like for Jonathan Huberdeau, Alexander Barkov. Personally, for me, I think Huberdeau should be around in the top 10. Personally, I wouldn't give it to him. I like to go kind of hot, and I like to give goalies a lot of credit. So I think it's between Ovechkin or Shesterkin for me personally. But I think with Huberdeau, there's a lot of people thinking that Barkov is one of the reasons, or maybe the reason why he's that high, and definitely he is one of the reasons. But I feel like with Huberdeau, he's just been on a different level consistently this year, which has kind of put him apart from a lot of other Florida Panthers players this season. I think he should get some recognition. But yeah, that was interesting. I didn't even realize that didn't have him top 10.
Yeah, and of course that's just one list, and again, I don't know what goes into that, and obviously the Athletic, a pretty credible source there, but yeah, I figured that that could be part of it. But Draisaitl and McDavid were both on that list, and Edmonton is in a worse playoff position than Florida, but I guess that's also recency bias, if you want to call it that, with Draisaitl and McDavid being household names in this league for the past several seasons, where maybe a lot of people maybe haven't heard of Jonathan Huberdeau unless they've played the Florida Panthers a lot recently, or follow that team, or fans of an Atlantic Division team. So I was kind of surprised to see him not there. But yeah, I agree. I think he deserves to be in the list. But whether it's Ovechkin, Shesterkin, or several other guys on that list, I'm blanking now conveniently who else was on that list. But if you said the names, they wouldn't surprise me at all. I know Timo Meier was on there for San Jose, another guy that's having a really, really good season. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this second half of the season shapes out. Hopefully all these games in February are able to be made up, and we don't get too many more cancellations, because I know that's just made this season feel incredibly weird. But we're at the halfway point now. We're almost there, and hopefully by the end of it, we'll be seeing the Dallas Stars in the playoffs, and maybe causing some trouble for whoever one of the top seeds in the Western Conference are. Because if they do make the playoffs, I imagine it'll be a wild card spot, and you're probably going up against Colorado or Vegas. And the Stars have had success in the playoffs against those teams recently, but this is a new season, and the Stars have shown some weakness, especially against Vegas. Two pretty frustrating losses to the Golden Knights earlier this year.
Yeah, if it is the Avalanche in the first round, I'd be super excited. I'm not gonna lie, that would be an amazing first round.
Yeah. I think, whenever it's those divisional matchups, they just play so much closer. And I think even in 2020, I know a lot of people had Colorado being the team that comes out of the West. And, if they come out of that game and win that game 7, I don't see any reason why they couldn't have beat Vegas that season. And maybe even, giving Tampa Bay a little bit better run for their money. So it would be a really fun series, because they would certainly be looking for revenge against the Stars. And the Stars, of course, would be looking to prove all the doubters wrong, that they're a good team and worthy of being in the playoffs. And again, if they're able to outlast this grind of a schedule that they have to close out the year, I think that playoff spot will be earned, and they'll have earned a little bit of respect across the league. And then they'll just have to go out and prove it, and have one last go around for guys like Radulov and Pavelski and Klingberg, hopefully, assuming all those guys are still there. But going to be really, really exciting to see how it all shapes out. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Nathan, thank you so much for joining the show. Super glad to have you on.
It's been a pleasure. Absolutely. And let's hope everybody, the Stars are in the playoffs in round 1.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, if the Stars, keep it kicking and keep doing really well this spring and into the playoffs, we'll have you on again and talk a little bit about some playoff hockey for sure.
That'd be great.
Well, guys, I certainly hope you enjoyed that conversation I got to have with Nathan. Really, really good time. Really, really good, nice guy. And he's very, very smart and knowledgeable on the NHL as well. Be sure to go check him out on YouTube. I'll have that linked down below in the description of today's episode. Big shout out to him. Big thank you for Nathan for coming on today's episode. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked on Stars. Be sure to subscribe to and follow the Locked on Stars podcast wherever you get your podcast at, whether that's here on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform. We are free and available wherever you listen, and no matter how you listen. You can also rate and review if you like what you hear. You can also find me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis. That's at DANE 2_LEWIS. Thank you again for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Now go make your second listen of the day, the Locked On Bets podcast, your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q, with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. Stars fans, thank you so much for tuning in and listening today. Tomorrow, we will be back with a game day preview. For the first time in a while, the Dallas Stars taking on the rival Nashville Predators, and we will be here to preview that entire game, talk about both teams at length to get you ready for the big matchup going down at the AAC on Wednesday night. We'll see you there, Stars fans. Have a great Tuesday.